The fluorescent lights of Patterson Industries hummed their usual monotonous tune as Marcus Chen stood in the CEO's office, his hands trembling despite his best efforts to stay composed. He'd known this moment was coming, had felt it building like a storm on the horizon, but nothing could have prepared him for the coldness in Richard Patterson's eyes as the older man slid the termination letter across his mahogany desk. "I'm sorry, Marcus, but this company runs on punctuality and reliability. You've been late 17 times in the past 2 months. 17. Richard's voice carried no sympathy, only the sharp edge of corporate efficiency. "I've built this company from the ground up, and I can't make exceptions, not even for sob stories." Marcus felt his world tilting. The sob story Richard dismissed so casually was his 6-year-old daughter, Emma, who had been battling leukemia for the past year. Every late arrival, every early departure, every distracted moment had been because he was a father, desperately trying to balance chemotherapy appointments, medication schedules, and the crushing weight of potentially losing the only family he had left. "Mr. Patterson, if you could just give me one more chance. The decision is final. Security will escort you out. You have an hour to clear your desk." As Marcus walked through the office that had been his second home for 5 years, his co-workers avoided his gaze. Some he'd mentored, others he'd collaborated with on projects that had saved the company millions. But corporate culture had a way of making people invisible when they needed visibility the most. Only Sarah from accounting managed a sympathetic smile, her eyes glistening with tears she couldn't shed in the open office layout that Richard insisted fostered transparency and teamwork. The drive home was a blur. How would he pay for Emma's treatments? Their insurance was tied to his employment. The experimental therapy that had been showing promise cost more per month than most people made in a year. He'd already sold everything of value: his wife's jewelry, the vintage car he'd restored with his father, even his wedding ring. All that remained was hope, and now that seemed to be slipping through his fingers like sand. Emma was at his mother's house when he arrived home. The apartment felt suffocatingly quiet. On the kitchen table sat a stack of medical bills, each one a monument to his failure to protect his daughter. Beside them was Emma's latest drawing, a crayon masterpiece showing the two of them holding hands under a rainbow. She'd written in her careful, crooked letters, "Daddy is my hero." Marcus buried his face in his hands and wept. But tears wouldn't pay bills or cure cancer. By evening, he'd made a decision. If one job wasn't enough, he'd work 3, 4, however many it took. Within a week, Marcus had cobbled together a patchwork of employment that would have broken most men. He drove for a rideshare service from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. Then, instead of going home, he worked a janitorial shift at a hospital from 3 a.m. to 7 a.m. He'd catch 2 hours of sleep in his car before spending his days applying for permanent positions and taking Emma to her appointments. On weekends, he did landscaping work for anyone who would hire him. Meanwhile, Richard Patterson continued running his company with ruthless efficiency. Profits were up. Productivity was up. Everything was up except employee morale. But numbers on a spreadsheet didn't capture the human cost of his management philosophy. Then came the night that changed everything. It was 11:47 p.m., and Richard was working late in his downtown office, reviewing quarterly projections. Through his window, he noticed something unusual in the park across the street. A figure moving through the darkness, distributing something to the homeless people who slept on the benches. Curiosity pulled him from his desk. He watched as the figure approached each sleeping person carefully, gently, leaving packages beside them without waking them. When the man moved under a streetlight, Richard's breath caught. It was Marcus Chen. Richard crossed the street, staying in the shadows, watching. Marcus was distributing care packages, sandwiches, bottles of water, clean socks, and small first aid kits. But he wasn't just dropping them off. He was taking time with those who were awake, sitting with them, listening to their stories, treating them with a dignity that society had stripped away. "The church gave me 50 of these packages," Richard heard Marcus tell an elderly veteran. "I wish I could do more, but at least it's something. Nobody should go to bed hungry." "You're a good man," the veteran said, his voice cracking. "Not many people see us anymore." "I see you," Marcus replied simply. "You matter." Richard felt something crack inside his chest something that had been frozen for longer than he cared to admit. He followed Marcus for the next hour, watching him distribute every package, help a young woman find information about shelters, and give his own jacket to a teenager shivering in the spring cold. When Marcus finally got into his beat-up Honda, Richard noticed something else. He didn't drive home. He drove to University Hospital, parked in the employee lot, and went inside wearing janitorial coveralls that he pulled from his trunk. The next morning, Richard made some calls. What he learned shattered the comfortable narrative he'd constructed about efficiency and accountability. Marcus hadn't just been a good employee before his termination, he'd been exceptional. He'd designed the logistics system that had saved Patterson Industries $2.3 million annually. He'd mentored junior employees on his own time. He'd volunteered to take pay cuts when the company faced lean times rather than see his teammates laid off. And his daughter. His daughter. Richard found Emma's story in a local news article about children battling cancer. The photo showed a little girl with a brave smile and no hair, clutching a stuffed elephant. The article mentioned that her father was doing everything humanly possible to afford her experimental treatment, working multiple jobs while never missing a single one of her appointments, the same appointments that had made him late to Patterson Industries 17 times. Richard picked up his phone, his hands shaking for the first time in decades. "Sarah, I need you to get me Marcus Chen's contact information. Then I need you to pull his complete employment file, everything." That afternoon, Richard Patterson did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He left the office early. He drove to University Hospital and asked for the pediatric oncology ward. He found Marcus emptying trash cans, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion, his movements mechanical. "Marcus." The younger man turned, and Richard saw the flash of anger before professional courtesy took over. "Mr. Patterson, I'm working. I can't afford to lose another job." "I know, that's why I'm here." Richard took a deep breath. "I made a mistake. The worst mistake I've made in my professional life. I fired a good man for being human, for being a father, for having priorities that actually matter." Marcus said nothing, just stared with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easy words. "I want you to come back to Patterson Industries. Double your salary, full benefits retroactive to your termination date, and flexible hours so you can be there for Emma." "But that's not all." Richard pulled an envelope from his jacket. "This is a check for $200,000. It's not charity, it's what I should have paid you for. All the ways you've made my company better and all the humanity you tried to bring to a place that didn't deserve it." Marcus's legs seemed to give out. He sat heavily on the floor, the envelope trembling in his hands. "And one more thing," Richard continued, his own voice breaking. "I've set up a foundation in Emma's name. It will help other families afford cancer treatment when insurance fails them. Because you're right, nobody should have to choose between saving their child and keeping a roof over their heads." The tears came then for both men. Marcus, because hope had returned when he'd thought it was gone forever. Richard, because he'd finally remembered what it meant to be human. 3 months later, Emma's treatment was showing remarkable results. Marcus was back at Patterson Industries, now as Director of Human Resources, implementing policies that recognized employees as people first and workers second. The company's culture transformed and, paradoxically, productivity soared when people felt valued rather than expendable. Richard Patterson learned that the metrics that mattered most couldn't be captured in quarterly reports. They lived in the gratitude of a little girl who got to keep her father, in the dignity of homeless veterans receiving care packages, and in the redemption of a CEO who'd almost lost his soul to the bottom line. On Emma's 7th birthday, she drew another picture. This one showed 3 people under a rainbow: herself, her father, and Mr. Patterson, who she called Uncle Richard. She labeled it, "Heroes Come in All Sizes." Marcus framed it and hung it in his office, a reminder that kindness isn't weakness, that humanity isn't inefficiency, and that sometimes the best corporate decision is simply to choose compassion. Because at the end of every spreadsheet, every quarterly report, and every corporate ladder, there are just people trying their best, fighting battles we cannot see, and deserving of grace even when they stumble. Especially when they stumble,